The cultural categories of race and ethnicity are used to uphold systems of social inequality. Now let's turn to race. How would you classify these two American men by race? What criteria do you use to make that judgment? These are two African American political leaders, father and son, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and Adam Clayton Powell IV. The son's mother was Latina, descended from Don Gonzalo Diago, who was mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico during World War II. Civil rights leader Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. on the left was very light-complexioned. The civil rights journalist Roy Otley described him as white to all appearances, having blue eyes, an aquiline nose, and light brown, almost blonde hair. He was a bold, outspoken black leader first as minister of the Abyssinian Baptist Church of Harlem, then as a New York City councilman, and finally as a U.S. congressman from the state of New York. Early in his activist career, he led 6,000 black people in a march on New York City Hall. He used his power in Congress to fight for civil rights legislation. In 1966, in Washington, D.C., he convened the first Black Power Conference. In his autobiography, Powell recounted some of his experiences with racial classification that left a lasting impression on him. During Powell's freshman year at Colgate University, his roommate didn't know he was black until his father, Adam Clayton Powell Sr., was invited to give a chapel talk on Negro rights and problems, after which the roommate announced that because Adam was a Negro, they could no longer be roommates or friends. Powell paid for his college education by working, and as a black man, he mostly found menial labor work. One summer he was working as a bellhop at a summer resort in Manchester, Vermont, when Abraham Lincoln's aging son Robert was a guest there. Robert Lincoln disliked blacks so much that he refused to let them touch him or wait on him, or touch his luggage, car, or any of his possessions. Blacks who did got their knuckles whacked with his cane. To the great amusement of the other bellhops, Lincoln took Powell for a white man and accepted his services. In 1982-83, Susie Guillory Phipps unsuccessfully sued the Louisiana Bureau of Vital Records to change her racial classification from black to white. The descendant of an 18th century white planter and a black slave, Phipps was designated as black in her birth certificate in accordance with the 1970 state law, which declared anyone with at least 1/32 Negro blood to be black. Assistant Attorney General Ron Davis defended the law by pointing out that some type of racial classification was necessary to comply with federal record-keeping requirements and to facilitate programs for the prevention of genetic diseases. Phipps attorney Brian Begay argued that the assignment of racial categories on birth certificates was unconstitutional and that the 1/32 designation was inaccurate. He called on a retired Tulane University professor who cited research indicating that most whites have 1/20th Negro ancestry. In the end, Phipps lost. The court upheld a state law which quantified racial identity, and in so doing affirmed the legality of assigning individuals to specific racial groupings. Under the American one-drop rule that applied to Susie Phipps, singer Mariah Carey would be black because she had an Afro-Venezuelan grandfather. What questions do these cases raise? What exactly is race? How many races are there? What is the purpose of categorizing people on racial lines? Who gets to decide the answers to these questions? Here's an initial definition of race: a system of social stratification whose membership is defined by birth. A person's membership in a race is usually closed. Persons may not pass from one division to another. The creation of new categories through mixing may be possible, but usually the person of mixed race is deemed to belong to the lower of the two racial statuses. Does this sound familiar? Does it sound like the definition for caste? It is easy for us to dismiss caste as unreal because we do not believe in the distinction of ritual purity and pollution that undergirds it. It's harder for us to dismiss race because many of us do believe in the biological idiom on which it is based. But it is just that, an idiom, an untranslatable phrase. Like caste, it is a cultural distinction people make real through our beliefs and action. It has no reality in nature. Anthropology has been trying to convince Americans that there's no biological basis for race since Franz Boas in the 1920s. The concept of race is a social and cultural construction. Race simply cannot be tested or proven scientifically, according to a policy statement by the American Anthropological Association, first written in 1928 and revised many times. It is clear that human populations are not unambiguous, clearly demarcated, biologically distinct groups. The concept of race has no validity in the human species. Questions? Okay, I have a question for you. If anthropologists are right about this, what would we expect to find if we look at race outside the US? Here are some Brazilians. Would you like to characterize their respective races? Most Americans would, on the basis of phenotypic characteristics, regard these persons as white. But in Brazil, each of these people is considered as of a different race. An individual who would be considered white in the United States could be labeled as one of several different races in Brazil: branco, or white; claro, or light; louro, blonde; sarara, light-skinned red-headed; or mulatto claro, light mulatto. This illustrates how fluid conceptions of race are when we move from one cultural code to another. Over 500 racial categories have been documented in Brazil. In one village of 750 people, 40 different racial categories were used. Two children of the same parents can be in different races if they look different. Let's try another case. Here we have two Japanese men. What races would you say they are? The man on the left is Ainu. The man on the right is Japanese, or Nihonjin, which means Japanese in Japanese. But if Nihonjin means Japanese, does that mean that the Ainu from Japan are not considered truly Japanese? The Ainu people of Hokkaido are understood in Japan to be descendants of the ancient Ainu or Emeshi people, and as such, biologically different from Japanese. In Japan, people who look biologically identical can be considered different races, the opposite of the Brazilian logic. So let's redefine race to clarify it and make it more cross-culturally useful. So here's race defined to focus on some issues related to social organization. Race, the system of social stratification based on cultural codes that interpret human phenotypes using an idiom of biology. Racialism, the belief in the existence of biologically distinct races. Different racialist societies make different classifications of people based on different sets of criteria. Racism is the hierarchical stratification of a society on the basis of race. Okay, let's try another exercise. What do these people have in common? They're all Wampanoag Indians. Ethnic groups are social groups who distinguish themselves or are distinguished by others on the basis of shared cultural features. Usually, This involves a struggle between self-ascription and other-ascription, that is, a distinction similar to, but not identical to, ascribed and achieved. The distinction turns on the question of who gets to decide how one is classified in society. Race and ethnicity are often confused in cultural practice. Let's return to the US to look at an example. An ethnic origin myth is the agreed-upon story of the origin and history of the group by selective reference to certain historic events and people. An ethnic boundary marker is any cultural trait that serves to distinguish members of one ethnic group from members of another ethnic group. Precise ethnic identities of individuals can be difficult to define because they are situational and may be hierarchically ranked, known as hierarchical nesting. Nationality, or political nationality, is the political identity of an individual or group based on citizenship of a particular country. Ethnic nationality, or primary ethnic identity, is a named ethnic group with a claim to a geographic region or homeland over which they should have political autonomy. Secondary ethnic identity is a subgroup of an ethnic nationality and thus does not have a claim to a separate homeland. Let's look at questions dealing with race and Hispanic origin on the 2010 census to get at issues and complexities of race and ethnicity even here in the United States. Question 8. Is person 1 of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? And 9. What is person 1's race? In question 8, the general category Spanish, Hispanic, Latino is not identified as racial or as ethnic, so it is presumed that respondents already know the criteria for self-inclusion in one or another of the subcategories. There are many possible criteria: language, national origin, culture of marriage or adoption, ancestral national origin, name, both given and surname, and appearance. No allowance is made that a person might identify as more than one of the subcategories, such as Cuban and Puerto Rican, or that a person might be both Spanish, Hispanic, Latino, and some other identity that's not Spanish, Hispanic, Latino, for instance, German and Spanish. In question 9, the phrase considers himself, herself to be clearly bases racial categorization on self-identification, yet no guidelines are offered for making this identification. Should it be based on race of ancestors, culture of origin, geographical origins of ancestors, appearance? Notice also that the list of racial boxes does not distinguish between presumptive biological racial groups and racial groups based on national origin. White and black are presumptive biological groups, whereas all of the other listed groups refer to national origin. The designated Other Asian suggests that respondents already know that the group names from Asian Indian to Samoan refer to Asians, even though Asian isn't defined anywhere. The lack of explicit criteria for membership in these various categories suggests that those who composed this census form assumed that Americans already have the answers to questions about their identities in the Spanish, Hispanic, Latino category and in terms of race. And since these answers were deemed worthwhile to collect, it must have been further assumed that they were accurate according to some unstated criteria for ethnic and racial categorization. Otherwise, what would be the value of collecting such data? Let's continue. Mixed race is not mentioned explicitly in question 9, but those who identify as mixed usually do so on the basis of known ancestry of more than one race. Therefore, since the 2000 census, the first one in American history, people have been allowed to declare mixed race identity in ways that appear to avoid the one-drop rule. However, In March 2000, when the government began distributing the census forms, the New York Times reported that the 5 racial categories and their possible combinations would yield 63 recognized racial categories, a number that would be doubled by the options in the Spanish, Hispanic, Latino category, for a total of 126 possible combinations. Would this make the U.S. more like Brazil? Not according to the Census Bureau. Anita Hotchkiss, Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, said the Clinton administration's policy concerning interpretation of the data was, if you are white and anything else, you are allocated to the minority. The reason for this, according to Sally Katzen, counsel to the director of the Budget Office, is the government's determination that people who have suffered discrimination in the past should be subject to certain protections. So our hypothetical Spanish-German person becomes Hispanic. The one-drop rule is reinstated, but this time supposedly to help minorities. Notice that in spite of the rich array of possibilities for racial identification, the census of 2000 and of 2010 do not allow respondents to reject racial identification completely, or even to identify as mixed without specifying how they are mixed. As this discussion should illustrate, race is not a clear-cut biological issue, it's a cultural construction. It is symbolic. The codes we use to define it are arbitrary. It is shared, yet different societies share different rules for defining race. It is learned. We are not born knowing our society's racial classification system. It is adaptive. How we classify race and what we do with those classifications changes over time. So why do we racially classify? That's not a rhetorical question. It is a key question to understand racialist societies. Read Sherwood Washburn's quotation. The number of races will depend on the purpose of classification. I think we should require people who propose a classification of races to state in the first place why they wish to divide the human species. I'll leave you to think about that. Let me just make a few points about globalization and changes in ethnic identity and social inequality. European expansion caused profound changes in and among ethnic groups, including the disappearance of some ethnic groups, the merging of 2 or more ethnic groups into a new form of identity, the integration of a smaller ethnic group into a larger one, with a secondary identity maintained for a time. In closing, let me make just a few points about globalization and changes in ethnic identity and social inequality. European expansion caused profound changes in and among ethnic groups, including the disappearance of some ethnic groups, the merging of 2 or more ethnic groups to form a new identity, and the integration of a smaller ethnic group into a larger one with secondary identity maintained for a time. Contemporary globalization has led to ever greater mixing of ethnic and, quote, racial groups, but also to frequent backlashes. Scenes of a London crowd or a Paris metro station suggest the legacies of colonial empires as well as increasing global diversity due to economic and political factors. According to a recent study, by 2050, Britain will be the most ethnically diverse nation on the planet, and by 2066, white Britons will be in the minority. But again, as we've just discussed in relation to the US Census, ethnic and racial identity remain hard to define and also contentious.